The rain came first, heavy, endless, and warm like the breath of a living thing. It fell on the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, turning trails into rivers and the earth into mud thick enough to swallow boots. The island itself felt hostile, alive, indifferent to men and their wars. Every step was a fight against vines, insects, and the sucking pull of the swamp. The Marines who landed there on August 7, 1942, knew almost nothing about this place. They had been told only that somewhere beyond the tree line, Japanese forces were building an airfield, and that was all they needed to hear. To the planners back in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the logic was simple. Whoever controlled the airfield controlled the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea route to Australia, and whoever controlled Australia would shape the Pacific War. To the men on the ground, there was nothing simple about it. Guadalcanal was not a grand strategy, it was hell wrapped in green. As dawn broke over the beachhead, the Marines came ashore in Higgins boats, their boots splashing into brown water, rifles held high. The smell of salt and rotting vegetation filled the air. Ahead of them lay a wall of jungle so dense that daylight seemed to vanish inside it. Somewhere in that jungle, the Japanese had been digging, building, sweating, and then they had vanished. The Marines expected gunfire, ambushes, snipers, but there was nothing. The silence was so complete that one soldier muttered, "It's a trap." Another replied, "Then it's the quietest trap in history." What they didn't know was that the Japanese construction units, mostly engineers and laborers from Korea, had fled into the hills at the first sign of the American landing. They had left behind their pools, their bulldozers, and something far more valuable, a half-finished airstrip. When the Marines reached it, the jungle opened like a wound. Before them stretched a long, flat scar of earth, half-cleared, dotted with crude wooden frames and barrels of fuel. The Japanese had been close to completing it. To the Marines, who were still learning the island's shape, it looked like a miracle. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, studied the muddy stretch through his binoculars. "We finish this," he said quietly, "and we can hold the island." It was that simple and that impossible. The captured field lay near the mouth of the Lunga River on the island's northern shore. To the Marines, it looked more like a swamp than a runway. Water pooled in the craters, jungle vines hung from the equipment, piles of Japanese gravel and coral lay abandoned in the rain. But amid the wreckage, one thing was clear. The Japanese had chosen this site for a reason. The land was flat, the coastline nearby, and the ocean breeze constant. The Americans realized immediately what their enemy had intended: a forward base from which Japanese bombers could strike Allied convoys and ships all the way to New Caledonia. The order came within hours: secure the airfield. The Marines, exhausted from the landing, dropped their packs and began to dig. Some cleared brush with machetes, others carried shovels or dragged heavy barrels of oil off the field. There was no plan, no schedule, only urgency. They knew that once the Japanese realized what had been taken, they would return, and they would come hard. At night, the jungle closed in, the air filled with the sound of frogs and unseen insects. Fires burned low, hidden beneath ponchos to keep from revealing positions. Men spoke in whispers. Many could hear distant movement in the trees, Japanese scouts probing the edges of the perimeter. The first firefights came on the 3rd night, short, brutal bursts of gunfire in the dark. By dawn, a few Japanese bodies lay in the mud, the first of many. The Americans worked faster. Using captured Japanese bulldozers, hand tools, and pure muscle, they began to repair the runway. The work was backbreaking, shoveling gravel under the tropical sun, hacking out drainage ditches, laying down crushed coral by hand. There were no engineers, no heavy equipment units, only infantrymen who had fought the day before. They didn't have a name for the place yet, but they knew what it would mean. When reporters later asked one Marine what it was like, He said, "It was like trying to build an airfield inside a nightmare." The rain came every afternoon, hammering down in sheets. The mud was bottomless. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Men worked shirtless, their skin coated in sweat and grime. Tools rusted overnight. Bulldozers sunk into the muck and had to be dug out with ropes. And through it all, Japanese aircraft circled somewhere beyond the clouds, waiting for the moment to strike. But slowly, the field took shape. Each day, the brown expanse grew wider, smoother, more defined. By the end of the first week, it was nearly ready for planes to land. The men could hardly believe it. They had carved a runway out of nothing: jungle, mud, and willpower. That night, a chaplain wrote in his diary, "We pray for strength, but I think God has already answered. He gave us bulldozers and Marines." The next morning, a squadron of Japanese bombers appeared over the horizon, escorted by Zeros. The first bombs fell before anyone could reach cover. Explosions tore through the trees, and the half-finished runway vanished under fountains of mud. The Americans scattered, diving into trenches and ditches. When the attack ended, the silence was broken only by the sound of rain on tin helmets. Then, slowly, the men crawled back onto the field. They picked up shovels and started again. One sergeant, his face streaked with dirt, looked up at the smoking sky and said, "If they want it, they'll have to bury us with it." 2 days later, on August 12, 1942, the first American aircraft landed, a single Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter. It touched down awkwardly on the rough surface, bounced twice, and rolled to a stop. The pilot climbed out, grinning, and raised his hand in salute. The Marines cheered. Henderson Field was alive. They named it after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway just 2 months earlier. It was a name that would soon be spoken with reverence across the Pacific. For the men who had built it, the airfield was more than a piece of dirt. It was survival made real. Every bag of coral, every shovel of mud, every hour spent sweating under fire had bought them one more day to live. They didn't know it yet, but that patch of earth would become the single most important lifeline in the Pacific War. And the Japanese, watching from the sea and sky, could hardly believe it. The Americans had taken their half-finished dream and turned it into a fortress.
The rain never stopped. It came down in thick, drumming waves, flattening the jungle, turning foxholes into swamps and trenches into rivers. For the men of the 1st Marine Division, Guadalcanal had become a world of mud and fever. Their boots never dried, their uniforms rotted on their backs. Their bodies were covered in insect bites and sores, and every breath they took smelled of damp earth, smoke, and death. Yet they kept digging, hammering, and dragging, because the airfield had to live. The Japanese had left behind a skeleton of progress, a handful of bulldozers, fuel barrels, and mounds of crushed coral, the raw bones of an unfinished dream. The Marines and Navy engineers took what they could and forced it back to life. They worked 12, 14 hours a day, often under artillery fire. When tools broke, they scavenged the wreckage. When engines failed, mechanics stripped spare parts from Japanese machines and welded them together with scrap. "We built it," one Marine later said, "out of sweat and curses and things that didn't fit." The field itself was a living enemy. Every night, the rain erased the day's work. The soil was a red, sticky clay that clung to shovels like glue. The drainage ditches overflowed. Bulldozers bogged down to their axles and had to be dragged out by 30 men pulling on ropes. Every morning, the work began again from zero. And always, the sound of engines overhead. Japanese reconnaissance planes circling high above the clouds. The Marines called them Washing Machine Charlie and Louis the Louse. They came every day, photographing, taunting, reminding the men that the enemy knew exactly what they were building. But the Marines refused to stop. The field grew yard by yard. Crushed coral dug from the beach and hauled by handcarts hardened underfoot. The first drainage trenches began to hold. The makeshift control tower, a wooden platform nailed to palm trunks, stood at the edge of the clearing. The men joked that it looked like a treehouse built by lunatics, but it worked. By August 20th, less than 2 weeks after the landing, Henderson Field was declared operational. The first squadron of Marine F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived that morning, banking low over the jungle and settling onto the rough coral strip. Their arrival transformed the mood of the island. For the first time, the Marines had eyes in the sky, a shield against the Japanese fleet. When the pilots climbed out of their cockpits, sweat glistening on their necks, the ground crews and infantrymen surrounded them in awe. "Welcome to the mud," someone shouted. The pilots grinned. They knew what it meant. Henderson Field wasn't just a runway, it was a heartbeat. That night, under a half-moon, the first Japanese bombers came. They were heavy twin-engine Mitsubishi G4Ms, Bettys to the Americans, escorted by Zero fighters. The alarm went up. "Air raid! Air raid!" And the men scrambled for cover. Henderson's new runway glowed faintly in the moonlight, an irresistible target. The bombers dropped their loads, and the jungle erupted in flame. Fuel drums exploded. Palm trees vanished in showers of sparks. Men dove into the mud, clutching their helmets, as shrapnel screamed overhead. When dawn came, the field was cratered and smoking. A few planes burned, their aluminum frames curling in the heat. But the rest, astonishingly, were still flyable. And before noon, they were back in the air. That day, they intercepted another Japanese formation coming in from Rabaul. In a twisting dogfight over the sea, the Wildcats and Dauntless shot down nearly a dozen enemy bombers. Henderson Field had drawn blood. For the first time, the Marines saw proof that their suffering had meaning. But the cost was merciless. The Japanese Navy had not given up the island. Every night, destroyers came roaring down the narrow channel between the islands. The men called it the slot, bringing supplies, shells, and troops. The Marines nicknamed the nightly bombardments the Tokyo Express. The ground shook as naval guns rained fire on the airfield. Craters opened, hangars collapsed, and men died in their sleep. Then, as soon as the sun rose, the men crawled out and began filling holes again. "We built it by day and buried our dead by night," wrote Corporal James Travis, a construction worker turned rifleman. Every morning the field was smaller. Every evening it was whole again. The mud became both their prison and their salvation. It swallowed the shrapnel, muffled explosions, and absorbed the blast. It kept them alive even as it drowned them in exhaustion. Malaria swept through the camp. Men worked with fevers of 103 degrees, their skin yellow, their eyes glassy. The medics handed out quinine tablets like candy. There was never enough food, only canned meat and rice. The pilots began to lose weight. The mechanics' hands blistered and cracked. Still, the runway held. The first supply planes arrived in early September, twin-engine C-47s dropping crates of ammunition, medical kits, and food. The Marines ran into the open to unload them, working knee-deep in water as Japanese shells burst around them. One pilot remembered seeing a Marine waving him in with 2 red flags, shirtless, grinning, bullets kicking up dust around his feet. "That man," he said later, "was braver than any flyer I ever met." The Japanese could not believe it. From captured reports, American intelligence learned that their enemy referred to Henderson as the airfield that will not die. Night after night, Japanese officers watched from the hills, convinced the Americans would abandon it, but each morning, new smoke rose from the repaired runway. A Japanese engineer captured in September told his interrogators, "You are not men, you are ants. We destroy, and you build again." By the time September turned to October, the coral runway gleamed white under the sun. It was still rough, still uneven, but it was alive, a lung breathing in supplies and breathing out war. The men who built it didn't think of glory or medals. They thought of survival. Each plane that landed brought them another day to live. Each plane that took off struck another blow for the living. When one of the Seabees carved a sign from a scrap of wood, he nailed it to a post at the airfield entrance. It read, "Henderson Field, built with blood and mud." And that was the truth. The Japanese still had the numbers, the ships, and the night, But the Americans had something that could not be bombed away: the will to hold the ground beneath their boots. Every shell that fell only hardened that will. And the airfield, shimmering in the heat, was their proof that miracles could rise from the mud. By the first week of September, the airfield that had once been nothing but jungle mud had come alive with the roar of engines. The pilots who flew from its uneven coral strip called themselves the Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied codename for Guadalcanal, Operation Cactus. Their headquarters was a collection of tents and sandbag walls. Their operations table was a plank of wood propped up by empty ammo crates. And their mission was brutally simple: keep the airfield alive at any cost. Each morning began before dawn. The mechanics, barefoot in the mud, hand-cranked engines that had been patched together from spare parts and luck. Pilots stumbled from their tents, their eyes red from sleepless nights and malaria fevers. The smell of burnt aviation fuel mixed with jungle rot. They ate canned rations, drank black coffee thick with bugs, and walked straight to their aircraft: the Grumman F-4F Wildcats, Douglas SBD Dauntlesses, and TBF Avengers that would carry them into battle. They had no radar, no warning system, and barely enough fuel to fight. But when the lookout on the ridge yelled, "Bandits! Bandits inbound!" they scrambled like lightning. Within minutes, engines screamed and dust billowed from the runway. The Cactus Air Force clawed its way into the sky, always outnumbered, often outgunned, but never absent. The Japanese raids came almost daily. From Rabaul, from Bougainville, from every corner of the Solomons, waves of bombers escorted by sleek silver Zeros swept down on Guadalcanal. Each time the Americans met them in the air. The dogfights began as tiny dots against the blue sky and ended with falling fire. Planes exploded, wings snapped, engines trailed black smoke into the sea. When the fight was over, the survivors limped home to Henderson, often on fumes, sometimes with bullet holes in their wings, sometimes landing on one wheel. The ground crews cheered them in, patched the holes, refueled, and pushed them back out again. The rhythm never stopped: fly, fight, repair, repeat. The airfield became a living thing, breathing with the beat of propellers, sweating oil, bleeding smoke. It was both fortress and target, a patch of coral that refused to die. Among the pilots was Captain John L. Smith, a 26-year-old Marine aviator who would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. His logbook from September 1942 was a list of exhaustion: scrambled 3 times, 20 Zeros sighted, 2 confirmed kills, 1 engine damaged, no sleep. Smith led his men into the air 3, sometimes 4 times a day. When his Wildcat was riddled with bullets, he swapped into another. When that one failed, he borrowed a plane from the Navy. "The airfield is the heart," he told a reporter later. "If it stops, we all die." By early September, the air war had become constant. The Japanese called it the bleeding sky. Every day they sent new squadrons, trying to level Henderson Field and crush the defenders before more American reinforcements could arrive. But each time, the Cactus Air Force rose from the mud like ghosts. To the Japanese pilots, it seemed impossible. They destroyed fuel dumps, bombed the runway, set fire to planes. Yet the next morning, the Americans were back in the air. One Japanese ace later wrote, "We thought they had endless planes, endless pilots. But now I understand. They just refused to quit." The Marines on the ground lived in a nightmare of noise. The air battles thundered overhead. Japanese shells from destroyers rained down at night, shaking the earth. Each day, Japanese infantry probed the perimeter, snipers, saboteurs, and raiding parties slipping for the jungle. The defenders called it Hell Island. And yet, the airfield kept them alive. It was their lifeline. Every cargo plane that landed brought not just food and ammunition, but hope. When the Japanese Navy tried to send reinforcements down the slot, the Cactus Air Force pounced. Dauntless dive bombers swooped low over the sea, their bomb racks emptying into convoys. TBF Avengers skimmed the waves, launching torpedoes at destroyers and transports. Wildcats dove into dogfights so close to the water that spray hit their windshields. The results were devastating. Ships burned, men died, and Japanese supply lines began to crumble. "Every ship that tries to reach Guadalcanal burns," one Japanese sailor wrote. "The sky belongs to the ghosts." But the ghosts were dying too. The constant flying, malaria, hunger, and fear took their toll. Pilots fell asleep at the controls. Ground crews collapsed from exhaustion. Mechanics used chewing gum and safety wire to hold engines together. The airfield was patched so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt of coral and craters. Then came the Battle of Bloody Ridge in mid-September, when Japanese infantry nearly overran the airfield itself. The fighting was so close that pilots grabbed rifles and joined the line. The enemy broke through twice before the Marines drove them back, bayonets and grenades clearing the jungle yard by yard. When the shooting stopped, the airfield was littered with shell casings, blood, and broken aircraft. But it was still there. As dawn rose over the smoke, a lone Dauntless bomber taxied to the runway, its pilot grim and silent. He took off over the bodies, flew east, and bombed a Japanese convoy approaching from Rabaul. It was the perfect symbol of the fight. Battered, bloody, unyielding. By early October, the legend of Henderson Field had begun to spread. Radio operators in Hawaii called it the patch that won't die. Newspapers back home began to speak of the men of Cactus, who fought on half rations and no rest, but somehow kept the Japanese from taking the Solomons. Major General Alexander Vandegrift wrote in his journal, "If Henderson falls, the Pacific falls. If Henderson stands, there is still hope." The Japanese commanders understood that too. They prepared for their largest counterattack yet, one that would bring the heaviest bombardment the Americans had ever faced. But the men of the Cactus Air Force didn't know how to surrender. When asked by a war correspondent what kept them going, a young pilot named Bill Tex Freeman grinned through cracked lips and said, "We didn't come here to die. We came here to make the other guy do it." The next weeks would test that defiance beyond anything they imagined. Because soon, the nights would burn like daylight, and Henderson Field would face its greatest trial yet. The nights came black and endless, filled with rain, thunder, and the sound of engines, not from the sky, but from the sea. The Marines could hear them before they saw them, the low, steady hum of Japanese destroyers and cruisers slicing through Iron Bottom Sound. Every night, without fail, they came down from Rabaul, bringing troops, ammunition, and death. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express, and Henderson Field was always its final stop. On October 13, 1942, the sky over Guadalcanal turned to fire. Two Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, crept within range under cover of darkness. At 1:30 a.m., they opened fire. Their 14-inch guns hurled shells the size of oil drums into the jungle. For an hour and a half, the island shook as if the earth itself were being torn apart. Every blast ripped craters in the runway, fuel dumps exploded like volcanoes, planes burned in their revetments. The concussion lifted men off the ground. Corporal Jim Travis, crouched in a trench near the airstrip, later said, "It wasn't bombardment. It was the end of the world." By dawn, Henderson Field was a graveyard. Craters 6 feet deep scarred the runway. Twisted aircraft lay in heaps. Every tent had been shredded. 60 Marines were dead. The Cactus Air Force had been nearly wiped out. And yet, even as the smoke rose, the men crawled out of their holes, picked up shovels, and started filling in the holes again. Someone found a half-burned sign that still read, "Henderson Field, built with blood and mud." They nailed it back up. The Japanese thought the airfield was gone. They didn't understand. Henderson Field couldn't die because its men refused to let it. By mid-morning, ground crews had patched the worst of the craters with crushed coral and sandbags. The surviving aircraft, just 19 fighters and dive bombers, were repaired by hand. Mechanics worked shirtless in the heat, coughing in the smoke, their hands raw and bleeding.
When the first Wildcat took off that afternoon, its wheels kicked up coral dust from the shell craters. It roared into the sky, trailing smoke, and banked east toward an incoming Japanese convoy. The bombers followed, engines coughing, wings patched with tin. They hit the convoy just as it approached Tassafaranya Point, sinking 2 transports and scattering the rest. When the pilots returned, the Marines cheered. The airfield still breathed. That night, it burned again. The Japanese bombardments became a nightly ritual. Destroyers prowled the coast, their guns flashing in the dark. Shells screamed over the jungle. Marines huddled in their foxholes, praying the next one wouldn't land on them. Fuel tanks burst, trucks flipped, palm trees flew like matchsticks. The air was filled with the smell of cordite, diesel, and death. And yet, the next morning, every morning, the same thing happened. Men crawled out, wiped the grime from their faces, and went back to work. The pilots called it the rhythm of survival. Bomb, rebuild, refuel, fly, repeat. One morning, after a particularly brutal night, a dauntless pilot found a note pinned to a shattered palm trunk. It read, "You cannot kill what refuses to die." He laughed, taped it to the control tower, and took off. The Battle of Henderson Field began on October 23rd and raged for 3 days. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, veterans of China and Manchuria, launched a coordinated assault from the jungle. They attacked at night, screaming "Banzai" as they charged the Marine lines. The defenders, low on ammunition and half-starved, fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Some used machetes, some fought with entrenching tools. From the airfield, pilots fired machine guns from their cockpits, strafing the tree line. Ground crews manned perimeter guns. The wounded refused to leave the line. For 72 hours, Henderson Field became the center of the world, a place where mud and courage held the line against steel and fury. When the sun rose on October 23rd, the jungle was silent. Thousands of Japanese bodies lay in the grass around the perimeter. The attack had failed. Henderson still stood. But the cost was immense. The Marines were exhausted, sick, and starving. Food rations had dwindled to 2 meals a day, mostly rice and canned meat. Fresh water was scarce. Malaria swept through the camp like fire. Men's faces turned yellow from fever, their bodies wasted away. And still, every time the sound of engines echoed over the island, they dragged themselves up and fought. The Cactus Air Force, now down to a handful of planes, faced daily raids from Rabaul. The pilots had no reserves left, no replacements, no new aircraft, no new fuel. When a plane went down, it stayed down. But on November 12th, the impossible happened. A convoy of American transports, escorted by destroyers and cruisers, broke through Japanese lines and delivered food, ammunition, and most importantly, new aircraft. Wildcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses rolled down the ramp and onto the coral runway. The Marines wept openly. One of them shouted, "The cavalry's here!" That same night, the Japanese Navy returned for revenge. The ensuing naval battle of Guadalcanal was one of the most chaotic sea fights in history. In the darkness, ships traded fire at point-blank range. Shells exploded, searchlights cut through smoke, and entire ships vanished in fire. But when the sun rose, it was the Americans who still held the field. The Japanese had failed to destroy Henderson once again. From that point forward, the tide of the war began to turn. In Tokyo, Japanese commanders demanded to know how Henderson Field still existed. One naval officer, after seeing aerial reconnaissance photos showing fresh craters already repaired, reportedly slammed his fist on the table and said, "They are not men, they are termites. They rebuild faster than we can destroy." By November's end, the Marines were no longer the hunted. Henderson Field now launched daily raids across the Solomons, striking Japanese convoys, airfields, and supply depots. The airfield's roar, once a desperate gasp, became the steady pulse of American power in the Pacific. When the rains came again in December, the men stood on the coral runway and looked out over the sea. The mud still clung to their boots, the jungle still stank, but the sky above them was theirs. They had built an airfield out of nothing, out of jungle and blood and willpower, and they had held it against everything the enemy could throw. One Marine looked up at the battered sign and smiled. "Built with blood and mud," he said softly, "and held by ghosts." By December 1942, Guadalcanal no longer looked like the same island. The mud was still thick, the rain still fell, and the jungle still swallowed everything it touched. But now the sound that ruled the air was the constant hum of American aircraft. Henderson Field, once a strip of scarred coral carved from chaos, had become a fortress. The Cactus Air Force, now reinforced by fresh planes and pilots, no longer fought for survival, they fought for control. From dawn to dusk, the airfield thundered with the growl of engines. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and Avengers lifted off in perfect rhythm, their propellers chopping through the humid air. The men on the ground, mechanics, Seabees, and Marines, watched them go with quiet pride. Every takeoff was a statement. We are still here. We are not done. The Japanese Navy had not given up completely. The Tokyo Express still made its desperate runs through the slot, bringing troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. But now, by sunrise, American aircraft were waiting for them. The skies that had once belonged to Japan were filled with contrails of American planes diving on enemy ships, their bombs and torpedoes slamming into steel hulls. Each explosion out at sea was another nail in the coffin of Japan's Pacific ambitions. The men of Henderson could see the results from the shoreline, columns of smoke on the horizon, the black silhouettes of burning ships. Sometimes wreckage washed ashore, helmets, crates, oil drums, and the occasional shattered torpedo. The sea itself seemed to surrender pieces of the war it could no longer hide. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Allies had momentum. The victory on Guadalcanal didn't just secure one small island, it changed everything. It forced Japan onto the defensive and gave the United States its first true foothold in the Pacific. From Henderson Field, American bombers could strike deeper into the Solomon Islands, cutting off supply routes, isolating enemy garrisons, and paving the way for the next campaigns: New Georgia, Bougainville, and eventually Rabaul. But none of that was clear yet to the men who lived through it. To them, the victory felt small, personal, and hard-won. They were too exhausted to celebrate. Most were skeletal from malaria, their clothes in tatters, their faces hollow. They didn't feel like conquerors, they felt like survivors. A war correspondent visiting the island that December wrote, "They have built an empire out of mud. They live in holes and eat from cans, but they have done something no one thought possible. They stopped Japan." When the order finally came for the Japanese to evacuate Guadalcanal in early 1943, it was done in secret. Under moonlight, destroyers slipped into the darkness, taking with them the last of the battered, starving soldiers who had once sworn to hold the island forever. By February, the campaign was over. Henderson Field stood untouched, its coral surface gleaming like bone in the tropical sun. The Marines gathered near the runway, too tired to cheer, too dazed to process what they had accomplished. Some wept quietly, others sat in silence, smoking, staring out over the field they had built with their bare hands. Major General Alexander Vandegrift walked the length of the runway that morning. He paused beside the sign, faded, bullet-pocked, half-buried in coral dust. Henderson Field, built with blood and mud. He touched it gently and whispered, "And held with everything else we had." In the months that followed, Henderson became something else entirely, a symbol. New squadrons arrived, bringing sleek new fighters and bombers. Engineers paved and expanded the runways. Where once there had been tents and foxholes, there were now hangars and workshops. But the soul of the place never changed. Pilots who arrived in 1943 could still see the scars of battle, twisted wrecks rusting in the grass, half-buried craters, and bullet holes in the old control tower.
The veterans of the first campaign would point to those scars and say, "That's where we held." To the men who had fought there, Henderson Field wasn't just an airfield. It was proof that America could adapt, endure, and outfight an enemy who, until then, had seemed unstoppable. It was the first time in the Pacific War that Japan had been decisively defeated on the ground. The myth of invincibility, the one that had begun at Pearl Harbor, died in the mud of Guadalcanal. In Tokyo, Japanese officers studied the loss with disbelief. They had underestimated the Americans, assuming their resolve would crumble under jungle heat and starvation. Instead, they had found an enemy who could build an airfield from swamp, repair it under bombardment, and defend it with everything they had. One captured Japanese officer later said, "We thought Americans were soft, but they fought like machines. When we destroyed, they rebuilt. When we killed, more came. It was not human." Years later, veterans of Guadalcanal would return. They would walk the old airstrip, now paved, silent and peaceful, and remember what it had been. Many would stand in the same mud where they had once fought, close their eyes, and still hear the sound of dauntless dive bombers overhead, the scream of shells from the sea, the steady rhythm of hammers repairing what the night had destroyed. Some said they could still smell it, the mix of coral dust, fuel, and rain, the scent of Henderson Field itself. In a 1962 reunion, one Marine named Jack Davidson summed it up simply: "We built a runway, sure, but what we really built was the first step to victory." The story of Henderson Field is the story of the Pacific War in miniature, a tale of endurance over comfort, ingenuity over despair, and courage over fear. It began as a patch of mud and ended as the foundation of a new world order. What the Japanese had started as a weapon of conquest, the Americans finished as a monument to resilience. Henderson Field wasn't made of steel or concrete, it was made of will. And in the end, that will changed the course of history.